Okay, we got unfortunately no cover there, and don't worry about my clothing. This is just a matter of what was dirty. And yes, that is the rule of what I wear. It's whatever's dirty and laying around on my floor. And honestly, I don't have any of my usual stuff around, so this is what I want. So, we looked at Peter the Great, and unfortunately, as before, I don't have the magazine to put in front of you. All I have is the game itself. Overall, this is not quite what I had hoped for. I guess what I had hoped for was, one of the old SPI quad game style games that I didn't have to think about. I came to this with the feeling of, wow, I really need something to relax. I don't know why. What did I do? Magic Realm, which was a bit of a hassle. Also, I just wanted to get something out. I was tired from dancing. I wanted to get something out that I could put without a lot of effort. And this 90% fit that. But the problem is, it's a 3W game. The rules are fairly short. They don't tell you how many pages, but let's see. It ends on page 28, starts on page 21. 8 pages of rules. Call it 7 because there's a page of charts and tables. Call it 6 because this one doesn't count for anything. Really, really densely packed. And a different system than I expected. The difference is, the big ones, you had the differential combat results table, which... that's kind of neat because you don't have to worry so much about odds. The chart is very gradual, and you can kind of get used to, hey, about what number do I want here in terms of an advantage? Am I good? It's like firepower tables. It's even better, actually. It's the graduality of it is so helpful towards avoiding some of the problems that you have with straight odds tables. And in this game, it seemed to work pretty well. The other tables largely have to do, well, these two have to do with artillery fire. When artillery is bombarding alone, it doesn't just add its strength in, and the range at which artillery gets halved or can't fire any longer. And then you've got these fire zone rules. Another weird little idea. You can project these fire zones, and you use I can't find here little chits that represent them, and they present an inhibition to the enemy moving there. They may not be able to get into it if they try, and then they won't be able to continue moving, or they may even take damage from trying to get in there. Let's see what else we had. The zone of control being fluid. That's a weird feel. Again, that's an attempt to try to make the period flavor more, but I don't feel like whether you use a rigid or locking or any other kind of zone of control, or like this with mandatory combat but fluid movement, none of that seems to me to represent a particular era better than another. The fact that I can slip through is kind of cool, but then why can I fire? It's a matter of they've chosen to make the hex size at a size where you can no longer lock people into combat. I do not feel, from my knowledge of this era, which is limited, there's no question, that units in their semi-linear formation, actually fairly strong linear formation, not quite at the level of 7 Years' War, didn't become locked into combat. The amount of fluidity that this game allowed for movement felt completely anachronistic to me. I felt like I was playing more with panzers or something like that than linear deployments. Not again, not to the level of the rigidity that you get to 7 Years' War, but not too far. And it's not like musket and pike era, which is the preceding era, is particularly fluid. That also has very rigid formations that got locked into battle, and you see that in games like musket and pike. You see that in battles of the Age of Reason. When you try to represent and say, oh well, because the firepower ranges are a little shorter here than they are in the Napoleonic period, we're going to say units can move around beyond each other. Units could move close to each other without this, but you'd kind of have to represent, once something engages, it is actually engaged. And there's a reason locking zone of controls work in most pre-20th century games, really. Or other formats like Opportunity Fire and stuff like that. Leadership. If the units were less mobile, the fact that the leaders had to put all their units in command would make a little bit more sense. But as it stands, with the amount of mobility on the battlefield, except where there are, these fire zones and readouts and such not, that kind of hinder the advance, and there's kind of a desire to push through them. I feel like the command control rules prevent, in conjunction with the amount of mobility, they prevent sort of an overall engagement of the type that really did happen in Poltava. So that, again, historically, it doesn't really project the right flavor. The Army morale rules, they seem pretty straightforward. You have a certain level at which you become demoralized, and then you'll be fighting on a worse chart. You have a little bit of trouble rallying your units comparatively, but it's pretty fitting, and the idea of an army breaking due to too much punishment is absolutely fitting in this era. This is not an era where armies were terribly resilient and could just stand that punishment all day long. And that kind of route involved pretty much the destruction of the army in the pursuit, assuming there's some cav and such not available. The particular situation, we'll get to the situation in a minute. Set of optional rules to give you different hypothetical scenarios, give you different chances of trying to play the game in different ways, and then a bunch of optional rules to handle some specific conditions. For example, the Swedish cav being able to charge, grape shot, visibility fatigue, dismounting dragoons, the rapid fire option, cav retreating, squares, all this stuff, the grenades, all kinds of little chrome that actually all works pretty well. The problem is in that core system where the zone of control, the fluid movement, it does not feel appropriate. Once you're engaged in this era, it was very hard to withdraw from combat. There are some problems, straight up, especially with the optional rules. It's a 3W game. That's generally the rule. They didn't really think through maybe how all the optional rules work together. Probably didn't even play test it much with them, which is a pity because those optional rules are one of the few reasons you'd want to play this game at all. They add some flavor to the system. In particular, the aids, and I've gone over this, the way they're worded, they can have no possible effect in the game. And here's another one. Yes. The rally. The cav versus routed infantry rule should have no possible effect if you read the rules the way they are, because cav should never be able to attack routed infantry. The routed infantry should be off the map by the time the cav get a chance to attack, and they won't get a double strike on the same unit. You can fix the aids easily enough, the cav versus routed. I think that's just a rule you have to throw out and say it just doesn't work. The presentation of the rules It's a pity that they chose to make most of the rules optional that give it some flavor, but I do understand that in the 90s, both 3W and the S&T magazine, I think they were in charge of it for a while there. They operated under a philosophy of nobody likes war games that are complicated anymore. Nobody ever actually played those. All they wanted were SPI quads, and we'll give them some optional rules for, the couple of people who can handle something that's more complicated than Napoleon at Waterloo. Okay, whatever. Obviously, that's not the case. Look at the success of modern companies and the demise of 3W. Yes, there was certainly and still is a segment of wargamers who just want to play, say, the Avalon Hill Classics or whatever. And getting some new battle with that level of complexity is appealing to them. I'm not saying let's not serve that market, but I'm saying, well, it kind of sucked because to me in the 90s, that's all I saw. Now, I'm getting exposed to, so I got exposed to some stuff like the Gamers fairly early on, and then to other stuff like GMT. Yeah, I got some exposure to them early on, but their components kind of depressed me back then, and now to things like Command Magazine, which looks like it has a little bit more aim towards someone who can handle, say, mid-70s and later war games. But this was targeted at a certain audience, and you can understand why they did that. What's difficult here, there are a couple of factors within the rules that I groused about that are pretty damn annoying in terms of picking up a fairly light game. One is just the layout of the rules. It looks like an SPI layout, but it doesn't seem to catch my memory the way the SPI rules do. So when I'm looking for the rule I'm looking for, I know I've read it, and I know it's in here, I can't find it. And some of that appears to be visual layouts, some of that appears to be putting, half the rules in the optional rules section. Also having so many special cases, and then a core system that's different from anything else. So I'm not just reading boilerplate like I would in the SPI rules. That boilerplate was pretty damn important. It meant you could skim the rules, and everything would more or less be where you expected it. And that meant you could find things real easy when you were looking them up. Hard to approach the first game you look at, first couple games maybe, but after a while, you just become very, very acclimated to that style of rules. This, looking so much like it, I started skimming it, feeling like I get that same experience, and it doesn't have the boilerplate. It's a different type of system, and that kind of threw me for a loop along with everything else. If you played this a few times, you would obviously get pretty used to it. It's not that, it's not a complex game by any means. All right, what about the situation? The situation's kind of clever. While we unfold this, we can talk a little bit about the graphics. Pretty uninspired. The counters, unfortunately, use what I'm used to from both Miranda and from the 3W stuff is this isn't a Miranda game, by the way. This is Stephen English or something. I don't remember the guy's name. Peter England, who apparently had a relative at this battle. The goals are kind of strange. You want to break the other guy's army, but within that, you get some certain victory conditions for the Swedes by picking up these crosses. But they get a lot of points towards breaking the Russian army by entering the camp in some strength. And it may be difficult to demoralize the Russians, certainly to break them, by not going into that camp, because you get a big 15 points. That's two heavy units, or two moderately heavy Russian units getting knocked out completely. So that's a lot of points for that one goal, but that's a tough goal to get to, in part because there is a series of where these R's are, redoubts, all kind of set up for the historical game. Again, makes the map less attractive. I would rather that be in kind of the grayed out tones that 30 Years' War used for SPI. But, you have no Redmond Simonson designing these graphics, that's for sure. The terrain itself is very harsh in some places. These ravines are especially nasty, but the woods are very limiting to cav, and there's a lot of cav on the game on both sides. The Swedes have more, probably. Some defensive advantage to the perimeter of the camp, and these swamps are kind of nasty to be in too, like the ravines. So you've got kind of this channel that you want your main thrust to go through, but it's filled with these redoubts, and those can really slow you down and force you into some trouble. But the problem is you kind of want to kill the units that are in them, because the Russians can't really defend it. If they throw too much forward, they're going to lose other units as well as the ones that are defending it. They can't really defend it terribly well early on, because most of their units are a little surprised, unable to come out of the camp. I've seen some people say, I presume the game is unwinnable by the Swedes. They say it's terribly unbalanced. I think actually as a game it's pretty well balanced. I usually don't speak too much about that, but when I see something that makes it sound like it's not, I had a total nail-biter of a game. Now, it swung between, one side or the other getting a marginal victory. And, well, no. Sort of in the middle area, it was swinging between a marginal victory for one side or the other. At the end, it was either a marginal victory for the Swedes on the last turn, or a dominating victory by the Russians, because the Russians would completely break the Swedish army. But if the Swedes could get away without being broken, they were going to win a marginal victory, which is pretty exciting as a game. However, as any kind of simulation, I feel like the core system, that whole locking, the fluid zones of control, mixed with other aspects. You could have those fluid zones of control, but then have engaged markers and crap like that. I find that core system absolutely fails to reflect linear warfare. There are some little gripes, like, squares shouldn't be necessarily they should suffer a disadvantage, especially against artillery bombardment. Yeah, you'd like to see that, but okay. There's a little bit too much fiddliness in terms of marking down each casualty on the tracks. You can't just count the casualties, because units that were routed off the board don't count against your morale. So you can never recheck to see if you got it right. The out-of-command markers, there aren't quite enough of them, and you're constantly placing them to help remind you what goes where. But I guess my biggest gripes against this have to do with the historical, the very core of the game fails historically, even though a lot of the flavor kind of helps. It helps make you pretend that it's historically accurate, but it's just too damn fluid. And, and maybe a toss-up between the rules presentation and the actual component presentation as well. When I see a map like this, I'm just not that excited to play it. This is fine if I'm getting a playtest prototype or something, but I've gotten spoiled both by the old SPI games, Avalon Hill, which even surpassed this kind of stuff. I always looked at Avalon Hill as, God, their maps are kind of ugly. And then, but this is from a dry period where maps just look like shit for the most part. And then nowadays, components and everything are really well done comparatively. One good thing, though, is this map's not made out of that crappy glossy stuff that they make nowadays. Overall, there ain't a lot on Poltava. If you're particularly interested in it from a historical perspective, this probably ain't the game for it. But if you're interested in, a lot of variety in terms of eras, periods that are kind of vaguely represented, and you can pretend that, this is realistic or something. As a game, it works fine. I'm not a person who buys war games, especially magazine games, in particular, expecting to get this highly competitive game. And something like this, I think, look, if you have very few games and you play this 4 or 5 times, it's worth it. if you have a fairly decent-sized game collection, you probably won't play this very often, and it just doesn't give the adequate historical perspective to be worth picking up for that purpose. So the only thing it really seems to me to fit is sort of the casual wargamer who hasn't made an opinion as to, here are some great games for competitive analysis. I mean, I don't know. Certainly it could be part of a competitive collection. It's so different from a lot of other things that I'm not sure that the competitive player necessarily wants to learn this new system. I just kind of question where it fits in and all. But I was a little bit more pleased with it than I thought, because I thought actually as a game it worked out better than I'd been led to believe it would. However, I had expected the historical flavor with all those special rules to come through a little more than it did, and it's just so violated by the core of the system. Up it goes.